All right, so for this exercise, I'm still using construct point, but we're gonna start looking at like how do we make more than one point, right? Because the power of this software is that it is really good at doing repetitive things, right? And things that are algorithmic in nature. Um, so I'm going to create some static numbers that aren't going to change, and then I'm going to start creating sets of numbers. Okay, and this is going to be your first time looking at like data as a generator. Um, so let's go to params, and let's go to input, and then there's a pretty cool param here that I use very frequently called panel. Um, the panel looks like this. It can be used a number of different ways. We're gonna kind of roll it out slowly, so I'm only going to introduce to you like very few things that I need at the time, and then you'll start to understand like the full breadth of what it can do later. But basically, this panel, if you double click it, it's just like a text box. So you can write alphabetical or numerical values in this text box, which is really important to know. But if I'm trying to create a static number, let's go with 0, for instance. And I'm just going to make it a tiny little 0 like that. Okay, and I'm going to plug this into Z. And I'm going to plug one into Y. All right, so what this means is I'm setting a solid static value of 0 to Y and Z. Now, I did it with 2 panels, but in reality, you don't need to have 2 panels because the data is just the data, right? This 0 is going to be a 0 no matter if I plug it into 1 or 2 or all 3 of the inputs for that point. So in theory, I only needed 1. Now, you'll see here that I did plug it into all 3. So if I had another value, like 5, and I plug it into X, it will disconnect the old value, and it will give me a new value of 5 right in the X input. So now the real question is, how do I make multiple points with one operation, right? So, and I'm only going to do this example with another panel here real quick, but like let's say we had a 2, for instance. And I want to now have a point that is at the x2 and the x5. If I try to plug in the 2, it's going to override it and disconnect the 5. But if I want to have both, hold shift, and you'll see that the arrow thing will turn green with a very, very tiny little plus sign next to it. And now you can grab the 5 and add that on as well. And so what you'll see is that now I have a 2 point and a 5 point. Does that make sense? Yeah? All right, so I'm going to just give you a quick sec to get caught up on that before we start going into number sets. A number of you encountered an error, right? Your node turned red. What that means is that you have some sort of error in the definition. And in this case, what you guys probably encountered is that you went into your text box, you typed 5, and you hit enter. And then you hit OK, right? And it did that. And I'm hoping you'll at least understand a little bit of this, but I don't expect you to fully understand it yet. But the reason it did that is because when it is a 5, like that, it's a number. When you hit enter, it becomes text. Okay, and that falls under the syntax umbrella, right? So this is where you kind of get into a little bit of like the coding stuff that we were talking about on the first day, is that this is visual programming, right? So what you're encountering here is a syntactical error that we've accidentally changed our number to text. Okay, so it's reading it as alphabetical number, not a numerical number, if that makes any sense. Okay. So anyway, that's important to know, and then it should show up like that. So now let's create like a number, a set of numbers. So let's go up to sets, and we're going to go to sequence, and I'm going to create series. So that's under set and sequence series. Okay? Now, since this is like our first unfamiliar tool, I want to show you how to read the tools and learn how they work on your own. So basically, if you hover over the middle, it'll tell you what the tool does. So it says it's going to create a series of numbers, right? Pretty obvious. I already told you that was going to happen. But whenever you're trying to figure out your definition and how to achieve a certain result, you need to understand like what it's going to produce, like this. It says 10 locally defined values, right? And then it has a list of numbers. And then you also need to read what it's asking you for. Okay, so in this case, it selected a range of 10 numbers from 1 to 10, or 0 to 9. That's actually a very important distinction too, is that 0 is very important in this software, but we'll kind of get to that in a moment. So it's asking you for the first number in the series, which it defaulted to 0, and then it's asking you for the step size, meaning how far of a step from one number to the next. So that value could be 1, or it could be 2, or 3. And then it's going to ask you for the number of numbers, the number of values. So let's move this down here a little bit, and let's actually take a look at that data. So I mentioned that the panel is incredibly powerful, so I'm going to go back into params, and I'm going to go to input and pull another panel, and I'm going to put it over here to the right of my series node. So what's cool about the panel is that it allows me to see that data. Okay, so we're going to be doing this a lot so that we can understand what's happening when we start changing the information, because without this, it's going to be hidden, and the only way you're going to see that data is if you're hovering over that. So let's drop in a couple of sliders. So I'm going to create a slider here for, well, actually, we don't need sliders. We need static numbers. So I can copy this, and I'll put it up here, and we're going to leave, we'll start it at 0, sure. That's fine. I don't really need to put a node on there for 0, but I'm doing that for you so you can see it. And then the step size. I'm actually going to use a slider here. So let's go to 0 is less than 5.0. Plug that in. And it's going to, at 0, it changed these values. Now they're all 0. That's because I have 10 numbers that start at 0 that have 0 of a step between them, so it just stays at 0. If I change this value, you'll see that those numbers are going to increase. Does that make sense? Any questions? No? Okay. So, so the last thing that I have here is a count of how many numbers. So on that one, I'm going to create a slider of 0 to, I don't know, 50. And then plug that into count. And when it says 0, then you're going to get this little orange wire and an empty panel. That's because we have created 0 numbers, if that makes any sense. But as I increase this, you'll see that that list grows. So now, I'm going to kind of close my thought on this and then let you guys catch up. But if I get rid of these values and I plug my series into the X, I'm going to have a series of points that are being generated. And as I change these values, if I change the step size, it's going to collapse. If I change the count, it's going to change how many there are. Okay? Pretty powerful stuff, right? Doesn't look like much yet, but it is. Okay, so why don't you guys go ahead and get caught up with that, and then we'll move into something else.